In the spring of 1890, the United States Post Office Department completed what it called the most comprehensive structural survey of federal mail facilities ever conducted. The survey covered 4,311 post office buildings across 26 states, evaluated each one for construction quality, floor integrity, load-bearing capacity, and fire risk, and assigned each facility a maintenance classification from A through D. The results were compiled into a single report, bound in 2 volumes, and filed with the Postmaster General's office in Washington. I want to be clear about what kind of document this is before I tell you what I found in it. This is not a suppressed record. It is not a classified file. It has been sitting in Record Group 28 at the National Archives since 1903, cataloged and accessible, available on request to any researcher who knows to ask for it. It is the kind of document that gets read by historians writing about postal administration and then set aside, because on its surface, there is nothing unusual about it. A bureaucratic survey. Classification A through D. 47 facilities recommended for disposition. And then I started checking what happened to those 47 buildings. I was researching something else entirely when I found it. I was trying to understand the federal government's decision-making process for property disposal in the 1890s, a narrow administrative question about how obsolete federal buildings were transferred to local governments or private buyers. And I pulled the 1890 Postal Survey as one data point in a broader accounting of federal building stock in that decade. I was not looking for anything unusual. I was looking for transfer records. By the time this is over, you will understand what I found when I put that survey next to a second data set that no one, as far as I have been able to determine, has ever placed beside it. And when you see what lines up, I think you will have the same difficulty I had explaining it away. The survey's classifications were unremarkable in most respects. Buildings in good repair received an A or B. Buildings with moderate structural issues received a C. Buildings the department considered functionally obsolete or structurally compromised received a D, which in the report's language meant recommended for replacement or disposition at the earliest practicable opportunity. 47 buildings across the 26 states received a D classification. I wrote that number down, set the report aside, and went looking for what had actually happened to those buildings in the years immediately following the survey. That is where the project changed. Of the 47 buildings classified D in the 1890 survey, 31 no longer existed by the end of 1893, not decommissioned, not transferred, not sold. Destroyed, 22 of those 31 were destroyed by fire. The fires occurred in a span of 14 months, between the fall of 1891 and the winter of 1892 to 1893. Different states, different structures, different reported causes, lightning in neighboring business, a stove malfunction, cause unknown, cause unknown, cause unknown. I found the fire reports through a combination of state fire marshal records and local newspaper archives. Because the federal government kept no centralized record of fires in federal buildings at that time, which is itself a fact worth holding on to. I put the list of fires next to the list of D-rated buildings and found that every single one of the 22 structures that burned had been built before 1860. Every one. Not most of them. All 22. The 9 D-rated buildings that were demolished rather than burned, demolished in the ordinary way through a contractor with a disposal record, were all post-1860 construction. When you put those 2 data sets next to each other, something happens that I have not been able to explain away in 2 years of trying. I want to be careful about how I describe what I found next, because the temptation in a situation like this is to move faster than the evidence warrants. I am not going to do that. I am going to tell you exactly what the records show, in the order I found them, and let you sit with the same questions I sat with. There is a collection of papers at the New York Historical Society, deposited in 1931 by the estate of a man named Arthur Fenwick, who served as a regional postal inspector for the Northeastern District from 1884 through 1901. Fenwick was not a significant figure. He appears in no published history of the Postal Service. He left no public writings, no published correspondence, no record in any newspaper that I have found beyond a brief obituary in the New York Tribune in 1921 that describes him as a retired civil servant and says nothing further. What he left was a set of working files, inspection reports, internal memos, expense ledgers, and handwritten notes accumulated across 17 years of fieldwork that his family kept in a trunk in a house in Queens and eventually donated to the Historical Society in 1931, along with a larger collection of family papers and photographs. The Fenwick collection has been catalogued since 1935. It is not hidden. It is listed in the Society's finding aids, it is accessible through their reading room, and it has been available to any researcher who requested it for 90 years. I found a reference to it in a footnote in a 1978 journal article on the administrative history of the United States Postal Service, published in a now-defunct academic journal called Postal History, which described the collection as routine professional papers of a minor Northeastern inspector of limited scholarly interest. The 1978 scholar was not dishonest. He had probably skimmed the collection rather than reading it carefully, which is the ordinary way that archives get described by researchers who are looking for something else. He was wrong about what was in the trunk, because Arthur Fenwick made a list. He made it privately, not as part of any official filing, and he made it at a time when the fires had already started. He made it in 1891 in a pocket ledger he labeled D Buildings, Old Stock, Notes for the Record, and the list cross referenced the 1890 survey's D-rated buildings against a separate inventory he had apparently assembled himself, an inventory that the 1890 survey does not reference, and that I have not found in any official Postal Department record. Fenwick called it the grid notation inventory. He did not explain what the grid was in the ledger itself. He simply listed, next to each pre-1860 post office building on the D-rated list, a notation indicating whether the building was or was not on what he called the grid. 31 of the 47 D-rated buildings carried this notation. 31. The same number as the buildings that no longer existed by the end of 1893. This is the part I keep returning to. The 1890 survey report does not mention a grid. The Postmaster General's correspondence files for 1890 and 1891, which I reviewed in full at the National Archives, do not mention a grid. The internal memos circulated within the Postal Department's Buildings Division during those years, available in the Record Group 28 files, do not mention a grid. The only place I have found the phrase grid notation or any reference to a grid as an organizing principle applied to pre-1860 postal buildings is in Arthur Fenwick's pocket ledger, kept private, never filed, and sitting in a trunk in a donated family collection at the New York Historical Society for 90 years. Consider what it means that Fenwick made this inventory. He was a regional inspector for the Northeastern District. His official remit covered post offices in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. The D-rated buildings on his unofficial grid notation list, however, are not confined to his region. They span the full 26-state footprint of the 1890 survey. A Northeastern regional inspector had no official reason to be inventorying postal facilities in Ohio, in Virginia, in Missouri, in Louisiana. He was doing it on his own. He labeled it Notes for the Record. And he used a term, the grid, that implies he was cross-referencing something, placing these buildings against some kind of organizing framework that told him which ones were on it and which ones were not. The question I could not move past was, what was the grid? And that is where the second Fenwick document comes in. Because the pocket ledger was not the only thing in that trunk that related to this project. There was a second item, a folded paper, tucked inside the back cover of the ledger, that turned out to be a hand-copied excerpt from what Fenwick identifies, in a note at the top of the page, as Circular No. 7, Buildings Division, Restricted Distribution, November 1887. I have not found Circular No. 7 in any official Postal Department record. It does not appear in the Record Group 28 Index. It does not appear in any finding aid for the National Archives postal holdings. What Fenwick copied from it, and he appears to have copied only a portion, not the full document, describes a classification system for pre-1860 federal mail facilities based on their original site selection criteria. The excerpt, as Fenwick reproduced it, states that a subset of pre-1860 post offices had been cited according to what the circular calls the meridian and baseline correspondence system, a method, the excerpt explains, of aligning postal facility locations with the land survey grid established by the General Land Office under the Land Ordinance of 1785, in such a way that the buildings themselves served as physical markers in the survey network. Physical markers, not just buildings. Reference points in the Federal Land Survey that had been accumulating since 1785, coded into the placement of post offices that were built during the period when that survey was actively being extended across the continent. I want to be precise about what this means, because the General Land Office survey is real. Its history is documented, and the relationship between postal facility siting and survey infrastructure in the antebellum period is a legitimate area of historical inquiry. The Land Ordinance of 1785 established the township and range system that divided most of the United States west of the Ohio River into a grid of 6-mile square townships, each subdivided into 36 1-mile square sections. The survey was administered by the General Land Office, which maintained a network of baseline and principal meridian lines, primary reference lines from which all measurements in a given region were calculated. By 1860, the General Land Office had established 37 principal meridians across the country, each with its own baseline, creating a continental grid of reference that made land titles, property disputes, military movements, and infrastructure planning possible at a scale that had never existed before in North America. The Postal Service, which was expanding its physical infrastructure across exactly the same territory during exactly the same period, would have had strong practical reasons to align facility placement with the survey grid. That is not a conspiracy. That is infrastructure coordination between two federal systems operating simultaneously in the same expanding geography. What Circular No. 7, as Fenwick copied it, adds to that picture is something different. It says that the alignment was not incidental. It was deliberate, documented internally, and known within the Postal Department's Buildings Division as a classification category. The meridian and baseline correspondence system that distinguished a specific subset of pre-1860 post offices from those built without reference to the survey grid. And the excerpt Fenwick copied includes a sentence that I have read many times and cannot read as anything other than what it appears to say. Facilities so designated carry primary survey correspondence and may not be demolished, transferred, or otherwise disposed of without authorization from the Superintendent of the Coast and Geodetic Survey. The Coast and Geodetic Survey, not the Postmaster General, not the Secretary of the Treasury, whose department oversaw postal construction. The Coast and Geodetic Survey, which was the federal agency responsible for maintaining the accuracy of the National Survey Network. The buildings, according to this internal circular, required sign-off from the Coast and Geodetic Survey before they could be touched. Because they were not merely post offices. They were, in some functional or archival sense that the circular does not fully explain in the portion Fenwick copied, part of the survey infrastructure itself. This is the part I keep returning to. Because if that is true, if a subset of pre-1860 post offices were cited as physical reference points in the federal survey grid, and if that relationship was documented internally in a restricted circular that never entered the public record, and if those buildings were carrying a designation that required sign-off from a separate federal agency before they could be demolished, then the question of why 22 of them burned in a 14-month window between 1891 and 1893 becomes a very different question from the one I started with. I went looking for coast and geodetic survey records from 1890 to 1893. The survey's administrative files from this period are held partly at the National Archives and partly at the NOAA Central Library in Silver Spring, Maryland, which inherited portions of the survey's historical holdings when the agency was reorganized in the 1970s. I found no record in either collection of any authorization granted by the Coast and Geodetic Survey for the demolition or disposal of post office buildings during those years. I found no record of any request having been submitted. I found no correspondence between the Postal Department's Buildings Division and the survey's office during the relevant period on any subject related to building disposition. The channel of authorization that Circular No. 7 required, according to Fenwick's copy, appears not to have been used. The buildings came down, and the fires happened, and the survey was apparently not consulted. The question is not whether the fires were accidental. Some of them may have been. I am not in a position to establish the cause of any individual fire from a distance of 130 years, and I am not going to claim otherwise. The question is why all 22 structures that burned were pre-1860 buildings, and why all 22 appear on Fenwick's grid notation list, and why not a single post-1860 building on the D-rated list burned, and why the demolitions of the 9 post-1860 buildings were handled through normal contractor channels with complete disposition records, while the destruction of the pre-1860 buildings generated, in most cases, a fire report that says cause unknown and nothing further. I ruled out age as an explanation. Old buildings burn more easily, that is true, and anyone could reasonably reach for it as the first innocent reading of this pattern. But the D-rated pre-1860 buildings in the 1890 survey were not rated D because of fire risk specifically. The survey evaluated fire risk as one of several independent criteria, and the buildings that received D ratings did so for varying combinations of factors: floor integrity, load-bearing capacity, structural stability under modern postal equipment, and what the survey's language called functional obsolescence, meaning the facility was too small or too poorly configured for contemporary mail. Volumes. I went through each of the 22 buildings that burned and checked their individual 1890 survey ratings against the breakdown of contributing factors recorded in the survey's facility sheets, which survive in the National Archives as part of the same 2-volume report. Of the 22, 11 had received their D rating primarily or exclusively on grounds of functional obsolescence, not structural failure, not deterioration. They were old but not decrepit. Several were described in the survey's own language as structurally sound but no longer adequate for volume requirements. Buildings described as structurally sound do not burn accidentally at significantly higher rates than other buildings. The age of the structures is a real variable, but it does not account for the pattern by itself. I ruled out coincidence by the numbers. The D-rated list contained 47 buildings. 25 were post-1860 construction. 22 were pre-1860. Of the 22 pre-1860 buildings, all 22 were destroyed by fire or by methods that left no disposal record. Of the 25 post-1860 buildings, none burned. Every demolition of a post-1860 building on the list was handled through a contractor with a full disposition record. The split is absolute. There is no mixing. Not one pre-1860 building on the list was demolished through normal contractor channels. Not one post-1860 building on the list burned. That is not a near miscorrelation or a rough alignment. That is a categorical separation. And categorical separations in historical data of this kind do not arise from chance. I ruled out administrative convenience, the argument that pre-1860 buildings were simply easier to dispose of informally because their records were older and less complete, making it likelier that fires would go uninvestigated. This does not hold, and it does not hold for a specific reason. The post-1860 demolitions were handled with rigorous paper trails, even though those buildings were subject to the same disposal authorization requirements under Postal Department regulations. If administrative convenience, cutting corners, skipping paperwork, were the driving factor, you would expect it to apply inconsistently across both cohorts, producing a mixed pattern of formal and informal disposals on both sides of the 1860 line. Instead, the pattern is clean. Pre-1860 buildings, all destroyed informally, through fire or through methods that generated no disposition record. Post-1860 buildings, all demolished formally, through contractors, with complete paperwork. The difference in treatment does not track with building age alone. It tracks with precisely the variable that Fenwick's grid notation list identifies, whether or not the building carried the meridian and baseline correspondence designation. What I could not rule out is the possibility that someone, at some level of the Postal Department's administrative structure between 1891 and 1893, understood that the pre-1860 buildings on Fenwick's list carried a designation that would have required Coast and Geodetic Survey authorization for legal disposal, and chose to bypass that authorization by allowing the buildings to burn, or by ensuring that they did. There is a letter in the Coast and Geodetic Survey's administrative correspondence from February of 1893, the last month of the fire sequence, that I found in the NOAA Central Library's holdings, not because I was looking for it specifically, but because I was reading through the survey's incoming correspondence for that year, trying to find any reference to the postal buildings. The letter is from a man named Henry Cabot, who is identified in the survey's records as a deputy administrator in the Buildings Division of the Post Office Department. It is addressed to the survey's superintendent, a man named Thomas Mendenhall. It is 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph concerns a routine matter about lighthouse sitting in Lake Michigan. The second paragraph, which has no apparent connection to the first, reads in part as follows. The writer expresses awareness that certain facilities in the disposal program of the preceding 18 months had been subject to designation under what he calls the old correspondence classification. Acknowledges that the proper authorization process had not been followed, and states that the disposition had been handled as it was given the impracticality of the formal process and the urgency of the construction schedule for the replacement facilities. The impracticality of the formal process. The replacement construction was not impractical. The authorization was impractical. Getting the Coast and Geodetic Survey to sign off on the demolition of 22 buildings that its predecessor office had classified as survey infrastructure was impractical. Perhaps because doing so would have required a public acknowledgement that such a classification existed, that these buildings had been carrying a designation that made them more than post offices, and that they were being destroyed rather than preserved or transferred. The letter is a single item in a bound volume of incoming correspondence. It was not flagged in any finding aid. It was not referenced in any subsequent survey administrative document that I found. Mendenhall does not appear to have responded to the second paragraph in any document that survives. The acknowledgement was made, and then the correspondence volume was closed and shelved, and the letter sat there for 130 years. This pattern was not unique to the Postal Service, and the postal buildings were not the only category of pre-Civil War federal infrastructure that disappeared in the same decade by similar means. The 1880s and 1890s saw a documented wave of disposal and destruction affecting customs houses in secondary port cities, land office buildings in territories that had recently achieved statehood, federal courthouses in smaller jurisdictions whose caseloads had shifted to consolidated district courts, and a particular class of harbor survey station that the Coast Survey had established at intervals along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts beginning in the 1830s. The harbor stations matter because the Coast Survey's own records document their original siting criteria in a way that the Postal Department's records, with the possible exception of the missing circular No. 7. Do not. The stations were cited as fixed triangulation reference points, positions from which the precise angles to other known points in the coastal network could be measured repeatedly over decades, building up a body of accumulated observational data whose value grew the longer the measurements continued from the same unbroken position. The survey's engineers understood this. The station's founding documents said it explicitly, and in the 1890s, several of those stations were demolished without the authorization required under the survey's own internal regulations. In at least 4 cases, New Smyrna on the Florida coast, Ocracoke on the North Carolina Outer Banks, Point Lookout at the mouth of the Potomac in Maryland, and Grand Isle off the Louisiana coast, the structures burned before any demolition order was formally issued. The fires were reported as accidental in each case, cause unknown, or a lightning strike, or a neighboring structure. The survey's administrative correspondence for those years contains no investigation of any of the 4 fires. No follow-up, no inquiry, no attempt to establish what had been lost beyond the physical building. The continuity of observation from those positions, some of it spanning 40 or 50 years of accumulated measurement, was simply noted as interrupted, and the stations were removed from the active triangulation network. If you know someone who works in the history of federal infrastructure, or in the archival history of the Postal Service, or in the survey history of the General Land Office, share this with them. The Fenwick Collection at the New York Historical Society is accessible. The Cabot Letter at the NOAA Central Library is in a cataloged volume. The 1890 survey report is at the National Archives. What connects them has not been published. What connects them has been sitting in 3 separate institutions for over a century, waiting for someone to place the data sets next to each other. What we lost, and I want to be careful here, because loss is the right word and I do not want to overstate what I can prove. What we lost in the 14 months between the fall of 1891 and the winter of 1893 was not simply 22 old buildings. What we lost was the physical infrastructure of a reference network that the federal government had spent 60 years building into the landscape. Buildings whose positions encoded information about the shape and extent of the National Survey. Information that existed nowhere else in the same form because the buildings themselves were the record. You can read the survey maps. You can read the General Land Office plats. But the buildings were the physical instantiation of the data, set into the earth at specific positions for specific reasons, and once they were gone there was no rebuilding them in their original function, because the function required them to be in those positions from the beginning, accumulating continuous records, and the continuity had been broken. The federal government replaced them with modern post offices that served modern postal volumes. The modern post offices were larger, better configured, more efficient in every operational respect. They were not in the same positions. They were not carrying the same designation. And no one wrote down why that mattered before the old buildings stopped existing, because the people who knew why it mattered were working from a restricted circular that never entered the public record. Circular No. 7 is not in the National Archives, It is not in the Postal Department's Record Group 28 files. The only copy of any portion of it that I have found is in Arthur Fenwick's handwriting, in a pocket ledger, in a trunk, in a collection of family papers deposited at the New York Historical Society in 1931 by people who did not know what they were leaving behind. Fenwick knew what he was leaving behind. He labeled it Notes for the Record. He kept it private. He spent 17 years as a postal inspector in a district that contained some of the buildings on his list, watching what happened to them and writing it down in a ledger he never filed and never shared. That is not the behavior of a man who thought someone would notice. That is the behavior of a man who knew no one was going to notice and wrote it down anyway, because he was a careful man and that was what he could do.